One of the biggest names taken down was Zhou Yongkang, the former head of China's security system. But there was still one thing missing: a way to do it on a larger scale. That even public restrooms use facial recognition to limit toilet paper, making sure no one takes more than they should. China has become the world's biggest exporter of surveillance technology, selling facial recognition and AI-powered monitoring systems to over 80 countries. The result? Governments in places like Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, and Pakistan have started adopting China's surveillance model, using it to monitor anyone who speaks out, track political opponents, and tighten control over their citizens. People who express controversial opinions online often find themselves banned from platforms, demonetized, or cut off from digital payment services. By the spring of 1989, frustration was building in China. A decade of rapid economic growth had transformed the country, exposing many citizens to foreign ideas and higher living standards. But with this progress came new problems. Prices were rising, corruption was spreading, and despite the economic boom, many people felt left behind. For years, students had been pushing for political reform, demanding greater freedoms. But every time they spoke out, the government responded with force. Among the few leaders who had once shown sympathy for their cause was Hu Yaobang, a high-ranking Communist Party official known for his reformist views. Unlike many in the party, Yaobang believed that China needed more openness, less censorship, and greater political freedom. His willingness to listen to student concerns made him popular among young people, but it also made him a threat to the party's leaders. In 1987, after student protests erupted across China, Yaobang was blamed for being too soft and was forced to resign. His removal was a clear message: political change would not be tolerated. But even after being pushed out of power, Yaobang was still a symbol of hope. Unfortunately, in April 1989, Hu Yaobang passed away. His death on April 15th drew thousands of students to Tiananmen Square to mourn, but grief soon turned into something bigger. What began as a tribute became a protest, not just for him, but for the ideals he had represented and the reforms that had been silenced with him. The movement spread rapidly. Tens of thousands of students took to the streets, demanding political change. The world's attention centered on Beijing. By mid-May, hundreds of Western journalists were there to cover Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev's visit. As he arrived, the protests grew even bigger, and nearly 1 million people filled Tiananmen Square. Cameras captured everything, and soon, the movement was being broadcast to millions around the world.
To Tiananmen Square.
Tiananmen Square.
Tiananmen Square. Tiananmen Square during the height of the army attack.
At first, the Chinese government hesitated. Some leaders, like Zhao Ziyang, wanted to negotiate. Others, like Premier Li Peng, saw the protests as a direct threat. By late May, the government lost patience. Martial law was declared. The army was sent in. But when soldiers tried to enter Beijing, something remarkable happened. Locals blocked their way. For a moment, it seemed like the people might win. Then came June 3rd. The tanks rolled in. The soldiers opened fire. The streets turned into war zones. By morning, Tiananmen Square was cleared, but the bloodshed continued. Across China, protests were crushed. Those who survived were arrested. Some were executed. The world reacted with outrage. Governments put sanctions in place. Western media called it a massacre, and the image of a lone man standing in front of a column of tanks became a symbol of defiance. But in China, this event was erased. The government called the protesters counter-revolutionaries and downplayed the violence. For decades, discussions of Tiananmen Square were banned. Even today, most young Chinese people don't know what really happened. However, the lesson the Chinese government learned from 1989 would shape its future. They realized that brute force alone wasn't enough. If they wanted absolute control, they needed a different kind of power. By 2011, frustration was once again building in China. This time in the small coastal village of Wuhan. For years, residents had watched as their land disappeared, sold off by corrupt officials with little to no compensation. It wasn't just about money. It was about survival. In a village of fishermen and farmers, land was everything. The anger had been growing for over a decade. Since 1998, more than 400 hectares have been taken. The people of Wukong had filed complaints, begged local officials, and waited for justice. But each time, they were ignored. Meanwhile, the officials who made the land deals were getting rich. By September 2011, the patience of Wukong's villagers had run out. On the 21st, they gathered outside government offices, holding banners and demanding answers. At first, it was peaceful. But as more people arrived, the atmosphere changed. Roads were blocked, government property was damaged, and tensions grew. Then, the police stepped in. People started fighting. Witnesses said officers attacked protesters without warning. By the end of the day, 3 villagers were arrested. The next morning, things got worse. A crowd of 200 stormed the police station, demanding the release of those taken. The response was brutal. According to villagers, hundreds of police officers and hired enforcers attacked them without restraint. One resident later described the chaos. They were like mad dogs, beating everyone they saw. For 3 days, the protests continued. The government called the demonstrators violent agitators, saying they had injured dozens of officers. But under growing pressure, the authorities made a calculated move. They pulled back. Police retreated. The local Communist Party chief, Wang Yang, stepped in, offering talks. On the surface, it seemed like a breakthrough. But many suspected Wang was stalling, trying to protect his own political future as he aimed for a position in the party's highest ranks. Days later, the government made a surprising concession. They would negotiate. Wukong's villagers elected 13 representatives to speak on their behalf, a rare moment of democracy in a country where protests were usually shut down. But before any real progress could be made, the arrests began. On December 9th, 5 of the elected representatives were taken into custody. 2 days later, one of them, Shui Jinbo, was dead. Police said he had suffered a heart attack. His family didn't believe it. When they saw his body, it was covered in bruises, his thumbs broken. They weren't allowed to take pictures, and their request for an independent investigation was denied. By December 12th, Wukong was in full rebellion. Thousands of villagers took to the streets. Every day, they gathered, demanding justice for Shui and the release of their leaders. Then, on December 14th, things escalated further. Protesters stormed the local police station. The government responded by sealing off the village. Roads were blocked. Food and water supplies were cut. The choice was simple: surrender or starve. But Wukong didn't give up. When the government tried to bribe villagers with rice and cooking oil in exchange for loyalty, only 100 people accepted. The rest refused to back down. The standoff continued for days. Then, finally, on December 21st, the government gave in. Officials agreed to meet the villagers' demands. Those arrested would be freed, Shui Jinbo's body would be returned, and they agreed to take another look at the land dispute. In exchange, the protests had to stop. In February 2012, Wukong held democratic elections, the first in its history. The villagers chose a new leadership, including Lin Zuluan, a key protest leader, and Shui Jinbo's daughter. But China doesn't forget. Years later, things in Wukong started falling apart. Corrupt officials returned, land disputes continued, and in 2016, Lin Zuluan himself was arrested. The Wukong protests left a mark. They showed that even in China, collective action could force change, at least for a moment. The government had avoided a massacre like Tiananmen, but the lesson remained the same. It wasn't just about shutting down protests. It was about making sure no one even thought about starting one. By the late 1990s, China's leaders were facing a new challenge, one unlike anything before. The country was modernizing, and technology was advancing fast. But with this progress came something the government feared: the internet. For the first time, ordinary Chinese citizens could access information beyond what the government allowed. News from the outside world, ideas about democracy, and uncensored discussions were just a few clicks away. The leadership saw a threat. If unfiltered information could spread freely, protests like Tiananmen or even Wuhan could happen again, only faster and on a much larger scale. So, in 1998, China began building the Great Firewall. It wasn't an actual wall, but a massive system of internet censorship, one designed to control what people could see, hear, and say online. By the early 2000s, new laws were introduced, forcing internet companies to monitor and report users. Websites that allowed open discussions were either censored or shut down. Google, Facebook, and Twitter were all restricted. Instead, China pushed its own platforms. Search engines like Baidu replaced Google, social media sites like Weibo took the place of Twitter, and messaging apps like WeChat became the new way to communicate. But these weren't just alternatives. They were tools of surveillance. Every message, post, and search was watched. The government controlled the news, changed search results, and wiped out any story that made them look bad. Those who criticized the government online could be banned from social media, arrested, or even disappear from public life altogether, facing harassment, job loss, or long prison sentences with no fair trial. At first, many didn't take it seriously. People found ways to bypass the restrictions using VPNs. But the government was always one step ahead, shutting down VPN services and increasing penalties for those caught using them. But this was just the beginning.